Hello, everyone. This is Professor Jonathan Zeiss again. Today, we are going to be talking about ancient Greek theater. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So, where we left off, talking about last time, the roots of theater. Theater was born out of religious ceremonies and rituals all throughout the world. And ancient Greece is one of those places, it's no exception. Um, Now, Dionysus is the ancient Greek god of wine, fertility, artistry, having a good time, benders, right? All this kind of thing. And he had a festival each spring to honor him. And there were followers of Dionysus. Thought he was really cool. And what they used to do is essentially march through the city of Athens, singing and dancing and singing the praises of Dionysus. They would have these things called dithyramb, right, which were hymns and dances to honor Dionysus. And they were composed by poets and different composers. And at some point, between 561 and 527 BCE, the 6th century BCE, this fella named Pisistratus, who was essentially like, think of a warlord, right? And these were still city states, right, in ancient Greece. So Athens was not part of a larger political organization known as Greece. It was just kind of Athens. Now, Pisistratus took over Athens, and he decided to give the cult of Dionysus an official state sponsorship. And you can kind of imagine someone coming in, a new ruler of an area, and he's a warlord, right? So it's not necessarily that legitimate per se. But what he does is he decides, you know what? Okay, we're going to take this thing that's a cultural tradition in this town and well, the city, right? And we are going to make it official. We're going to give it state sponsorship, and not only that, we're actually going to make it a contest, right? And so, not only are we going to fund this, but people will also come to see it because it is a contest, right? And have my name attached to it and everything. Um, if you know anything about the ancient Greeks, they love competition, right? Hello, the Olympics. And the composers of the best dithyrambs and the choruses who performed were given awards. So great. Now, what does this have to do with theater? So eventually, in all these dithyrambs, they were talking about Dionysus, saying, hey, Dionysus is great. Dionysus did this, they did this, right? Eventually, a chorus member stepped out alone sometime, right, in the middle of the 6th century BCE. As Dionysus himself, right? Instead of being a part of a larger chorus saying, hey, Dionysus did this, he would step out and say, ah, yes, I, as Dionysus, did this. And so he became the first actor, per se, one who portrayed the story instead of simply relating the story. Right? Tradition says that this first actor was named Thespis, who put on this mask of Dionysus and engaged with dialogue with the chorus, engaged in dialogue with the chorus. And that's why actors are called thespians, right, in honor of Thespis. And eventually, other gods were portrayed in dialogue with the chorus, and then voila, you have theater, right? People taking on roles, portraying uh, uh, an actual dialogue and an actual story themselves instead of just kind of telling about it. It's theater, right? Now, this is a picture I took. This is the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. This is where Medea and Oedipus Rex and Agamemnon and everything premiered. So it's obviously an outdoor theater. It's an amphitheater. You can see at the bottom, right, this kind of semicircular area. That's the orchestra, and I'll get to that in a second. But here I am at the top of the, I guess, stone bleachers or whatever, contemplating that, yeah, Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, we'll get to them, perform their plays here. Now, where is it? So the Theater of Dionysus, it is in the middle of Athens, right? It's not out in the boonies somewhere. You can see in the background of this picture was taken up Well, I'll tell you where in a minute. But you're looking down on the theater, essentially from the back of the house, right? Looking down at the stage, and behind you can see the city of Athens there. Now there is a building behind, and a little bit from my camera's point of view to the right, that kind of looks like a building with a top of a Rubik's cube, kind of a little bit askew, turned a little bit. That is a museum. That is the Acropolis Museum, because the theater actually looks up toward the Acropolis. Now, the Acropolis is probably one of the, no, definitely the most famous architectural landmarks of ancient Greece. Right here's a big bird's eye view. You can see, you can see the Parthenon up there. So the Theater of Dionysus is down on the lower left, right? And so it is definitely in the middle of the cultural center of this city, right? Um, and it'd be a great view. You can actually see another theater over, if you're, potentially on the stage looking up at the Acropolis instead of looking straight. If you look a little bit to the left, way over there, you can see another outdoor bowl amphitheater. That is the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. That's a newer theater, and I wanted to show you this theater as well, because these two stages were built, and essentially they're within a football field of each other, but they show the evolution of the Greek stage, and hence the evolution of the Western stage. Now they called it a theatron or a koilon, and I'll get to all of these, all these parts in just a minute. Now, the first thing I want to mention, the orchestra, right down at the bottom, right? That is here, right? It's the what looks like a checkerboard down there, and of course here it looks like the inside of a 3-point line, kind of that area where that fella is standing, even though he shouldn't be. That orchestra comes from the word orchiestai, which means to dance, right? And it makes sense because that's where the chorus often was, right? And a chorus was singers and dancers performing the dithyramb. And so that was the place for the chorus to move around and dance, right? The orchestra. Now, there is a small building, well, at least back here. If you look to the right, just behind the stage, you can see a platform that's maybe about 5 feet tall with a couple of stairs going up. With, it looks like some carvings on the front facing the audience. Now that is called the Scena, right? It is a building, or not in the first time, but it's that it was more of a platform, but it's a building behind the stage that was used for costume and mask changes. It eventually became the backdrop for the action on stage. If you look at the Odeon, it is significantly larger, right? The Scena, which is where we get the word scenery or scene, because Scena means tent or stage. Now, on the sides of the stage, right, you have the paraskenon, right, which para means beside, right? Words like paramilitary, right? Something kind of beside the military, paranormal, something kind of beside the normal. But those were to the sides, a little bit like wings are now, right? For entrances, exits, other changes and stuff. You have the proscanon, which pro means before or in front of, like a prologue is a before speech, right? Logos meaning speech, right? It's a speech before something. So the proscanon, it's an area before the scena. Now, if we look at the Odeon, you can kind of see, so the orchestra, at the back of the orchestra, there's a little bit of a raised kind of platform area. And in modern times, most theaters that we would think of, right, that you kind of have the audience on one side and the actors, you kind of look through almost like a window, a large window into the theater space. That large window era is called the proscenium. It is the type of theater it's called a proscenium, and that comes from the proscaenon, because it's an evolution of that part of the stage. And the logeon, a raised stage in front of the scena, um, where people talk. Now, the actual word theater comes from theatron, meaning viewing place, a place to see things. Contrast that with the Latin rooted word auditorium, which means a place to listen, right? So a theater at its root is a place to see. An auditorium at its root is a place to listen, which, in today, you can kind of think of a theater and an auditorium as somewhat interchangeable, but it does show a little bit of the differences in priorities between ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We'll get to those later. And then you have other things that you would obviously need for a stage, right? Walkways used by the chorus to enter and exit the orchestra, the parodos, kind of, if you think of the seating as a big fan, kind of the edges of the fan. And that would make sense, right? Because if you have a whole bunch of competitions, right? Obviously the actors would come in, the choruses would come in and leave, and you'd have to come in one side and leave through the other, right? All the audience isn't going to move around a lot. Almost seems like a parade. The kerkis are wedge-shaped seating areas. The klimakis are the staircases for the audience members because and we'll get to this later, but in the oldest theaters, the audiences were on a slant and the performers were level. The diasema, the walkway through the spectators' seating, you can kind of see it midway through that fan arc. And then you have, the nice seats for special people. And the right here, this picture was taken from the back, from behind the scena, as if you were kind of on stage looking out. And these stone seats with the backs and the armrests, it's for the judges and dignitaries and political figures and leaders of the city of Athens. So now that we know kind of where Greek theater took place, what was it like? What were some conventions of the Greek theater? Well, masks were very important. These masks were worn by everyone. They evoked character, right? They weren't just what are called neutral, right, with no expression. They were made of organic materials, so none of them survive. Made of things like, leather, hide, wood, hair, leaves, these sorts of things. So we don't have any of them, but we know what they look like because of artistic depictions elsewhere. Again, they were dramatic and expressive. They covered all the face, except for the eyes and the mouth. Some scholars used to think that within the mask there was constructed almost like a funnel that was used as an amplification device. But nowadays people don't really think that that was the case. People just thought that they had good diction and projection. There were three kinds of plays, right, at these festivals, these contests, right, the city Dionysia and others. Tragedies, comedies, and satyr plays, right? Tragedies and comedies, we can kind of guess what they are. Satyr plays, they were more like kind of comic musical interludes. The chorus, all of them wore the same plain, although not blank, but still relatively plain mask and costumes. They all wore raised shoes or cothurni. They literally elevated the tragic characters above the ground, made them literally a little bit larger than life. All actors were men because sexism. And there were elaborate costumes that evoked the characters that the actors played. Right? Now, there was also a mechanical apparatus called a mechana, which was essentially a crane and pulley system that was used to lift actors in and out, especially those that played supernatural characters, gods and whatnot. That's actually where the modern phrase, the deus ex machina comes from. Now, when we think of a Deus Ex Machina, we can think of kind of a hokey end to a story where just something random comes in and saves the day that's not really supported by the rest of it. It just kind of seems like a cheap way to have a happy ending. Now, literally, it means God from the machine, right? And so, from this machine, let's say the characters in this particular tragedy are in a bad way. There's no way out. They can't untie this knot by themselves. But who can? A god can. And so, a crane lowers this character of a god in, who fixes everything and then leaves, right? That is a god from the machine who comes in and cheaply kind of fixes everything. Now, the two main genres, I guess you would say, of ancient Greek drama were tragedy and comedy, right? Um, and they had more difference in conventions other than just kind of one was sad and one was funny, right? Tragedy depicted people as higher than they are, a little bit more elevated, um, not just literally, but in terms of kind of moral character, um, and situations and ability to speak, and often, in terms of like nobility, that kind of thing, literal nobility. Comedy would depict people as lower, a little bit more base, a little more crude, a little bit more rude, uh, a little bit less driven by reason than they are. Aristotle says that tragedy was written by grave spirits, and he means, serious and contemplative, and comedy was written by a more trivial sort. And we'll talk about pity and fear, catharsis, when we talk a little bit more about the poetics of Aristotle next time. But tragedy is supposed to arouse those things, pity and fear, often from a tragic flaw. Whereas comedy, um, they characters have flaws, but they are not tragic in the same way. They depict defects that are not painful or destructive per se. Now, tragedy is, again, this quote is because it comes from the Poetics of Aristotle. It is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. Right? And what they mean by an action, it's you could kind of think of that a little bit more like a story, right? Um, a plot, the story of something that is serious, right? It's not funny. It is complete, meaning it begins a place, develops, and ends at a place, and of a certain magnitude, right? Greek tragedies, ancient Greek tragedies, were not because, oh no, I have a hangnail, right? It's dealing with war and death and murder, all these kind of things of a certain magnitude. And they also had kind of longer lines of verse. Comedy had shorter lines. You have a little bit more back and forth in comedy. Tragedy is, likely less funny, and comedy is likely more funny. Although depending on the play and the playwright, who knows? But they are both imitations of an action, not imitations of characters, of people, really, but an imitation of kinds of stories that we go through in life. Now we get to people. Aha. Now, Aeschylus, who was born around, that's what the C is, right? Circa 525 BCE to 455. He is a fellow that introduced the second actor, right? Making dialogue possible on stage between characters, not just kind of a chorus. He fought in the Battle of Marathon, which took place at 490 BCE between Athens and Persia. And he wrote 90 plays, 7 of which survived. With all of these ancient Greek authors, you'll see that we know they wrote a lot more than we actually have. And, think of yourself. If there were 4 different contests every single year to write a really good play, and you would win prizes, why not write a whole bunch, right? Why not? So I don't blame these fellows for being really prolific. The oldest extant play that we have, the earliest one, is from 472 BCE. It is called The Persians, right? That is the oldest play script that we have. So he fought the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, and 18 years later, he wrote a play about his foe. Interestingly enough, the play itself is somewhat sympathetic to Persia. It takes place in the Persian home front, the city of Susa, and the play revolves around the difficulty of the Persian people, the ones left behind while the men went off to war, and what they had to deal with. He liked trilogies. That's not a new thing. His plays focused on moral and religious issues, right? A lot of the times, his characters were what we might consider today to be a little bit two-dimensional and flat, right? The conflicts were between the characters, not within them. And they were definitely kind of larger than life. And in that way, a little bit flat. Then we have Sophocles, the second guy, from 496 to 406 BCE. He introduced the third actor, which was inevitable, right? He wrote 120 dramas, of which we have 7. Ugh. His play Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, right, was the model play that Aristotle used in the Poetics. He referenced it to illustrate what a model tragedy was. So Aristotle would give examples of, hey, recognition and reversal is really important, and it's, done well, like Sophocles did in Oedipus Rex, this and this and this. Now, with Sophocles, there is an undercurrent of fatalism, right? Things that happen must happen. They're fated to happen. You can't do anything about it. You can't escape these things. Now, his characters were still elevated from real life, but they were a little bit more three-dimensional. You got to have a little bit more interior life and thought processes of Sophocles. And compared with Aeschylus, he also did, it was a little bit more character focused, a little bit less reliance on the chorus. And then we get to this fella, Euripides, who was born 480 around BCE and died 406. Now, he was the most psychologically realistic of the three. And incidentally, he wrote Medea, the play you're reading. He wrote 92 plays, of which we have 16 tragedies, and the only surviving satyr play, Cyclops. He was less popular in his life than Aeschylus or Sophocles. He won fewer awards. He even more diminished the importance of the chorus. But his characters, you could tell they were fighting with themselves a little bit more than against each other. Now we get to Aristophanes. Now we have those three, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Those are tragedy, the three great Greek tragedians that we have. The great Greek comedian that we have is Aristophanes, right? From 440 around to 385 BCE. He is known as the father of Western comedy. To describe in modern language kind of what the genre of his plays were, you kind of think of them as fantastical political farce, right? They were not something like domestic comedies or sitcoms, kind of that kind of thing. They were very much consciously, honestly political, right? Engaging with big ideas. They had fantastic and absurd settings. Like there's a play of his called The Birds, where you have a whole bunch of birds, yes, birds, trying to figure out what their ideal society was. And they decided to found a society called Nubikukulia, right? Translated in English to Cloud Cuckoo Land, essentially. And you can imagine that with that premise, a whole bunch of birds trying to argue political philosophy with each other of what the best way to organize a society is, pretty easily runs into poking fun at political figures and strains of political thought in the day. Another absurd or fantastic setting is A Path to Hades, right? Journeys into the underworld. Now, he did have fallible gods on stage, sure. He poked fun at them on stage. He insulted specific political and social figures of the day, including Sophocles, Euripides, the judges of the contests he would thumb his nose at. So in his play The Clouds, right, there is a character, Strepsiades, who gives the middle finger to the character of Socrates. The first recorded instance in the Western world of someone giving someone else the finger. Good old Aristophanes. Now, the chorus remained very important in old comedy, even though, as you get through Euripides and on in tragedy, it kind of diminished. But in uh, old comedy, which is this Greek old comedy, it still maintained its place. Now, moving on. Before we get into well, we're going to dip our toe into the poetics a little bit, talking specifically about plot structure, because, and we'll get to this next time too, but Aristotle thought that plot was the most important component of a play. All right, so Aristotle says every tragedy must have 6 parts, which parts determine, namely plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, song, and these complete the list, right? He thought that there is no other element to a play except plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, song. And he consciously listed them in order of importance. He thought that plot was the most important thing, right? And he says, but most important of all is the structure of the incidents. For tragedy is an imitation not of men, but of an action and of life. And life consists in action, and its end is a mode of action, not a quality, right? So he's saying that art or tragedy imitates life. It does not imitate people. You can put plots and relationships and actions that deal with real life and inform real life. But it's not as important to have characters necessarily that are true to real people in life. So he says, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete and whole and of a certain magnitude. For there may be a whole that is wanting in magnitude, right? Again, like a story of how I stubbed my toe would not be tragic. Even if it does have a beginning, middle, and end, it doesn't have a magnitude. A whole is that which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, this is often misunderstood. When people think about Aristotle saying that a good story or the best kind of story, tragedy, has a beginning, middle, and end, they mistake that for thinking that there's like a 1, 2, 3 act structure. But he's not really saying that. He's just saying that um, if a play is about one kind of, he calls an action, you kind of think of it as one plot thread or one conflict even, or one story. The story needs to start somewhere and it needs to end somewhere. And you need to talk about the middle. That's what he means. Those 3 things. A beginning is that which does not itself follow anything by causal necessity, right? But after which something naturally is or comes to be. An end, on the contrary, is that which itself naturally follows some other thing, either by necessity or as a rule, but has nothing following it. Right? So Aristotle thought that plot was, you had to start a plot with what we today would call an inciting incident, right? Where something happens, where something else, therefore this, therefore that, therefore this, therefore that, therefore this, therefore that, and then therefore nothing, right? And that's one story. A well-constructed plot, therefore, must neither begin nor end at haphazard, but conform to these principles. Now, understand that when Aristotle is talking about this, he is not saying this is how plays are structured. He is saying this is the best way to structure tragedies specifically. Now, his ideal plot, right? We can think of the arrows as going up and down by talking about kind of the levels of conflict. Now, something happens, and then there are complications of this conflict, so on and so on and so on, until there is a reversal and recognition. I'll talk about that in just a second. And that would be the climax where the play stops building up to something and then starts falling to something else, right? You could almost see as that is the point where a play where you think it might turn out well, then you know it's not going to turn out well. Right, and then there's unraveling. Things fall apart, and finally, he thinks there needs to be a scene of suffering because it's important to him that we see the character in agony on stage. in order to arouse those feelings of pity and fear. Now, reversal and recognition. Um, you can kind of think this is a little bit hard to wrap your head around, but what are those? What is a reversal and recognition? Now, Aristotle says that um, a recognition is, he talks about Oedipus. So the story of Oedipus Rex, broadly and generally, right, is so there's this king and this queen who have a baby, and a fortune teller says, "Hey, that baby's bad news. They're going to grow up and kill the king." Terrible. And so the couple thinks, "Oh no, this is awful. We will, we can't have that happen. This is the state. We are the state. We can't have that happen. So hey, you over there, kill this kid, even though he's our son." And that person is like, "I don't really want to kill a baby. They didn't do anything wrong, but I'll do the next best thing. I'll just send him really, really far away, right? So he might as well not even exist here, but I'm not killing him." Okay. So you have this baby growing up in a faraway land, Oedipus, who a fortune teller had prophesied to his parents over here that he would end up ruining them, killing the father. And so Oedipus grows up and, he's a capable person. He goes off on some trip for some reason. And he ends up finding himself on the road in an argument with someone. And, words are said, escalation happens, and they fight. And Oedipus kills this person on his way to this faraway land. And then he gets to this land, realizes, oh, wait, that was the king, but so he ends up marrying the queen. And then there's this big plague that goes around. People are getting sick, and he can't figure out why. He's the king of this land, and he can't figure out why people are getting so sick. Now, obviously, the gods are mad because he not only committed patricide, but also regicide and now incest. But he does not know that, right? He doesn't know that until there's a certain point where a messenger comes and reveals this. He all of a sudden recognizes this. He goes from a state of ignorance to knowledge. And at that point, the play turns. And instead of becoming a story about how Oedipus is trying to make things better, it becomes a story about how he can't and how it is going to get worse and worse. So those two things, how him realizing something causes the play to immediately change direction, is what a reversal and a recognition, or rather a recognition and a reversal are. And honestly, the best example of a story in kind of modern day narrative storytelling that I can think of is honestly the climax to The Empire Strikes Back. Now, if you think about it, and this is from the Poetics, recognition, as the name indicates, is a change from ignorance to knowledge, producing love or hate between the persons destined by the poet for good or bad fortune. The best form of recognition is coincident with a reversal of the situation. The recognition which is most intimately connected with the plot and action is, as we have said, the recognition of persons. This recognition combined with reversal will produce either pity or fear, and actions producing these effects are those which, by our definition, tragedy represents. Recognition, then, being between persons, it may happen that one person only is recognized by the other when the latter is already known, or it may be necessary that the recognition should be on both sides. So, spoiler alert for The Empire Strikes Back, right? But Luke, throughout the whole first movie and most of the second movie, his goal is pretty clear. Once he learns that Darth Vader murdered his father, he wants to defeat Vader, right? So that's throughout all the first movie and most of the second movie is, him trying to prepare to defeat Darth Vader. Okay, great. And so then the scene that you expect comes in. They have this big, huge conflict. And then he is brought from a state of ignorance to knowledge, right? He is ignorant of the fact that Vader is his father, and then he knows that Vader is his father. So that is recognition. How is that reversal as well? Well, it's because his whole plot, his whole drive changes. It shatters. He goes actually, and this is interesting that Aristotle says this, is a change from ignorance to knowledge, producing love or hate between the persons destined by the poet for good or bad fortune. Right? He goes from a hatred of this person who killed his father, all of a sudden realizing he is, then there is some love, and that shatters him because he can no longer pursue that. We later, in this movie, it's a tragedy. Later on in, the next movie, we learn that he actually changes goals. Instead of defeat Darth Vader, it becomes save him. But this is I think, a very good example of a moment where someone going from ignorance to knowledge about other people completely changes the direction of his story. Right. So this, right, this complication and reversal and recognition unraveling to a scene of suffering might remind some of us, if we know about kind of more modern storytelling structure, Freytag's pyramid. This is one that we might be most familiar with, right? There is exposition. This is the way things are. And then something happens, right? At that elbow between exposition and rising action, you could put the inciting incident. So this is the world as it is. Something happens. And in the Western world, this is conflict, right? There's conflict, 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 until the highest point of the conflict, which is the climax. And then once that gets resolved in some way, there's a falling action, the result of that ultimate point of that highest point of conflict. And then the denouement is, this is how the world is now, right? And so you go from the exposition, this is how the world was, to the denouement, this is how the world is now, through this change of conflict, the story of conflict. Now, in the Western world, and I'm sure you all have heard this, we think of a plot being based around conflict, but that is not necessarily true. There is a form of storytelling from the Far East, mostly identified with Japan, called Kishoten Ketsu, right? Where it's kind of a four act, you could say, structure. Something is introduced, we're familiar with that, and then developed more, we're familiar with that. But then there is a twist. But it's not so much kind of dealing with conflict as much as it is a recontextualization, or something out of the blue, some other thing that seems to have nothing to do with the introduction and development. And then we have the conclusion, which is where that first bit, the introduction that is developed, and then this twist get merged together. And what happens in this form of story is the dramatic question that we're asking ourselves when we see this is not necessarily how will this get resolved, which is one that which is a question that's primarily based upon conflict, but how do these two things synthesize together? Now, it's a little bit weird to kind of think of examples, but I think this is a pretty good one, right? So, obviously it's a 4-panel story, right? The first panel, the introduction, it's a woman batting away a younger girl with a broom, right? Stay away from my garden. It is further developed by her looking at the flower. Oops, sorry about that. Oop, that's not right. Go back. And then the girl running away saying, crazy lady, right? And then the twist, we are introduced to this completely different scenario. Wait a minute. We've been following this woman who has a garden with these glasses and looking at flowers. All of a sudden, we're at this completely different place with this other woman who seems to be just reading a newspaper with 2 coffee mugs. What does that have anything to do with it? And so our minds, because we think that these things are related, we're trying to figure out, well, what's happening? What's going on? And then the resolution, the conclusion is, you see that the woman at the beginning with the garden is giving this other person flowers. Oh, that recontextualizes, that lets us know, oh, that is why she was being so defensive about this garden. It's because it was meant for someone that she cares about. Now, notice that the plot is not really revolved around conflict. Sure, there is some sort of conflict in the first 2, but that's really not what the story is based around. The story is based around us seeing something very different, And then that the tension of how are these connected? How will this resolve? That is what is put together at the end. It's just a different form of storytelling that doesn't rely on conflict. So we also have episodic plots. Now, Aristotle says of all plots and actions, the episodic are the worst. He is not afraid of throwing out those opinions, right? I call a plot episodic in which the episodes or acts succeed one another without probable or necessary sequence. Bad poets compose such pieces by their own fault. Good poets to please the players, for as they write show pieces for competition, they stretch the plot beyond its capacity and are often forced to break the natural continuity. So he says that an episodic plot, we are most familiar with this, honestly, with television shows where things like sitcoms or procedurals, right, where there seems to be a conflict, a climax, and then it ends, and then something else happens, and that is resolved, and then something else happens, and that's resolved. Right? Aristotle kind of thought, well, either either your story is too small and you're trying to stretch the story out, or you're trying to make one big overarching story that isn't really there based upon other things that actually themselves are mini stories. Um, yeah, but we see this all the time as well in modern day, especially again with television. A circular plot, that is a type of plot that ends where it begins, implying, of course, that it will continue in the circle. Um, yeah, so that is talking about plot structure. Cool. Next time, we're going to talk a little bit more about Aristotle and the Poetics, what he thought, a little bit more about not just what a plot should be structured like, but what really should it be about? What types of characters should be in a plot? We're also going to talk about the other things: character, diction, thought, music, spectacle. Hope you all have a really good Tuesday, and I will see you all next time.